Hey guys, thanks so much for joining me today to talk about how to improve your speed to hire without sacrificing quality. A little bit about me before we get started. My name is Josh Tolan. I am the founder and CEO of a company called SparkHire, and we are most known for our video interviewing solution that's trusted by more than 6,000 customers. And in our 10 years of doing business, we've powered millions upon millions of interviews for all of those customers. And the reason I'm excited to talk about this topic today is that speed to hire is my jam. It's the whole reason I started my business. When I was way back when working for another company, speed to hire was the biggest problem in the company. So it was a smaller business. They didn't have an internal recruiting function, didn't have an internal HR function. So the business owners were doing all of the resume screens, the phone interviews, the in-person interviews, and it took them forever to run their hiring process, which resulted in them not always getting the people they wanted at the end of the hiring process, but also it took a lot of time and resources away from other areas of the business. So that's what inspired me to start my company as a solution to help with speed to hire. And here we are today talking about it. So to set the stage for everything, let's first talk about how your speed to hire is absolutely crushing you. And you may not know it, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will, and you'll also have some actionable strategies on what you can do right now to address it. So your speed to hire is crushing you in a few ways. Number one, you're losing talent. And this could be to competing employers, or this could be just simply to your process. And what I mean by that is you're moving too slowly and employers therefore are taking candidates away from you before you can get to them. Or your process is just too long and it's a turnoff to candidates, and therefore they're just deciding to drop out of your process altogether because they don't want to work for you as a result. The next thing is your costs are compounding. So they're piling up, and we'll talk about what those costs are because some people only think about a couple of them. So we'll get into that. And then lastly, you're sacrificing quality by cutting corners. So we'll talk about how to address that as well. Let's first talk about how you're losing talent. So first of all, like I mentioned, other employers are just moving faster than you. And your lengthy process is a turnoff to these candidates. A recent one by Robert Half, said that 62% of candidates start looking elsewhere if an employer takes 2 weeks or longer to respond following the interview. And after 3 weeks, 77% of those candidates just move on. Now, this is just one stat about one part of the hiring process, but it's evident that if you're just taking too long, candidates are going to drop out of your process for one way or another. And that might be leading to a candidate shortage. You might be thinking it's related to the market, but it could really just be related to the speed of your hiring process. So if you find that your candidate pool just dwindles from stage to stage, meaning people are just opting out constantly, that could be a speed to hire problem. And the way you address it is really speeding up your hiring process and then unlocking volume in your hiring process as a result. And we'll talk about how to do that. Now, I mentioned your costs are compounding, and most people just think about these two things. Number one, that you have to run job ads for a longer period of time, and therefore you're increasing your spend on the relevant ad channels that you're using to source candidates. And number two, the resources that you're using in the hiring process, you start to add up their salaries or their wages, and you realize that you're spending a lot of money with each passing day on the hiring process. But what a lot of people don't think about are what are the true bigger costs due to a slow hiring process. So number one, the cost of not having somebody in the seat. You're losing productivity. You're missing out on new business opportunities by not having somebody in place to do that job. And potentially the bigger cost here is that more than likely with somebody not in that seat, you have other employees in the organization that are filling that role in one way or another. And that could be causing them to burn out, which could create a turnover problem for you down the road. The next type of costs that start to compound are what I call the desperation costs. And this is where you start to increase spend exponentially in an effort to fill your pipeline back up as it starts to dwindle. Potentially, you're starting to engage staffing agencies to help you source more candidates. And while those can be effective, it can be quite costly for your budget. You start needing to increase compensation just to compete with other employers that are potentially getting to your candidates faster. And from a quality standpoint, you might end up hiring a less than desirable candidate just because your pipeline dwindles as a result of the slow hiring process while you're trying to fill that seat. Now let's talk about quality. So oftentimes what I see is that you start to cut corners when you realize that you just don't have enough time in the day to screen and interview all of the candidates that start in your pipeline. So if you're feeling like early on in the process that you're just rejecting people simply because you don't have enough time to take them through your process, that's a problem, and you're depriving your organization of talent. So think about it this way. If you have 100 candidates that apply for your job and 50 of them are qualified on paper, I'm sure there are many of you that are out there that are like, I can't screen and interview 50 people. So you cut that list down to 10 or 15 folks and you advance those people in your process. Well, now you're cutting out 35 to 40 people that are potentially good employees for you just purely based on time. And the other area where you're impacting quality from a slow hiring process is top talent just appreciates a quick process. So moving faster not only allows you to get to them faster before other employers, but also it leaves them with a positive impression of your brand, the quicker and more streamlined that your process is. And I could tell you this from real life experience that anecdotally, I've had Spark Hire employees tell me that, hey, late in the process, we were engaged with you, and I was engaged with you and a few other employers, and even had some other offers on the table. And honestly, one of the things that made Spark Hire the right company for them was, in their words, the seamlessness of the hiring process and the speed at which we move from stage to stage. We didn't take them through a bunch of hoops. We didn't have them run through a gazillion different types of interviews. We got them through from end to end very quickly, and they felt like that was reflective of the organization as a whole, whereas some of the other organizations took them through so many interviews, took weeks to get back to them, and they felt like that was not a good reflection on the organization. So the speed of our hiring process was actually a deciding factor on them coming to work for us. So let's look at some of the numbers. And this is from a benchmarking report from SHRM, a recent one where they surveyed thousands of organizations. And here are the average number of days that these organizations are spending on the steps that you see on the slide here. So on average, organizations are spending 8 days screening applicants, 9 days interviewing candidates, and 6 days going through the final decision and offer stage of the process. So this is about 23 days here that on average companies are spending in these 3 steps. And this is where we're seeing the hiring process really, really drag out. So if you're moving faster than this already, great, but there's probably still a lot of opportunity to improve. If you're moving at the same speed as this or slower, then we definitely got to implement some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today. And one of the things that we see drag out the hiring process the most is your interview stages. And we'll talk about this here in a minute. But the interview process, as we saw on the last slide, is typically what adds the most time. You saw on average, most organizations were spending about 9 days in this part of the process. Your goal working in HR, working in recruiting, typically lives at the front end of the hiring process. Your goal is to get quality candidates in front of your hiring managers as quickly as you possibly can. And we'll talk about how you can do that. So along the lines of what's dragging out your hiring process, there are really 3 things that I want to focus on today. So number 1 is misalignment before the hiring process begins. Number 2, as I just mentioned, your interview stages. And this could be because you have too many interviews with too many different people. This could be because you're taking too long to make decisions. So there's too much time in between steps. And that's the third point, your time between steps, and your poor communication with candidates in between those steps is causing candidates to drop out of your process and slow down your process as a whole. So let's first discuss hiring process alignment. This is the price of admission for a fast hiring process. You have to get your HR team, your recruiters, whoever's handling the front end of the process aligned with the hiring managers who are responsible for the back end of the process. Misalignment between these people on the hiring teams costs you in a variety of ways. Number 1, you lose days just simply because somebody's not doing what they're supposed to be doing in your hiring process. Number 2, you waste time interviewing the wrong candidates because there's misalignment on the requirements. There's misalignment on who's moving forward. And then number 3, probably the most costly, is the blame game, where hiring managers are blaming HR recruiters and vice versa about what's slowing down the hiring process, why the right candidates aren't getting through the process, and why you're ultimately not making a hire. And we'll talk about 3 ways to improve that hiring process alignment today. Number 1 is a hiring manager kickoff. Number 2 is defining strict requirements for the role and how you can use those to speed up your process. And number 3 is committing to an SLA, and we'll talk about all three of these right now. So let's start with the hiring manager kickoff. So this is typically a meeting, consider it like an intake meeting. And for this meeting, a hiring manager should come prepared with an approved job ad, with a description, along with the interview questions that they intend to use at every step of the process. You want to align on the specific criteria that they're looking for so you get a good feel for what you're trying to identify earlier in the process and send over to them. And then what I would do is ask questions to the hiring manager as if you're a candidate. Basic questions that you think every candidate is going to ask. And that way you can build a glossary or an FAQ that you can use earlier in the process when you're communicating with candidates. And that avoids you having to go back to hiring managers when a candidate has a question that you can't answer, and it helps keep things moving smoothly. Agree on the hiring SLA, which we'll touch on here in a minute, and then have a continuity plan. So I see this often where organizations either push off hiring because somebody's going to be out of the office, or the hiring process stops when somebody's out of the office, let's say for a planned vacation. You have a business need to fill that seat, and so therefore you can't slow down the hiring process just because somebody's going to be out of the office. Yes, there might be a requirement where you need that person who's out of the office to meet with a candidate, but there are things that you can do to build a continuity plan. So if that's going to be the case, you make sure there's constant action going on in your hiring process so you don't miss a beat. Let's talk about the requirements for the job. So this is where, obviously you need to be objective and you need to have all the things that you're very specifically looking for. But what I'm talking about here are what are the bare minimum requirements, or what are like the things that would disqualify a candidate from being somebody that could not be considered for the role. You don't want to go overboard here because you're going to include these on your job application. So you don't want to add like 20 different things here, 20 different requirements that have yes, no answers, because then people are going to drop off of your application process. You want to add the bare minimum, but things that will give you a binary yes or no. So these are things like if you are requiring somebody to work on site in an office, let's say a couple of days a week, you might want to add a yes/no question to your application to make sure that they can do that. Because in today's world, if somebody's looking for a remote job and you're requiring them to come in the office, let's say 1 to 2 days a week, you want to make sure they can do that. If they can't, you're just wasting everybody's time. You're wasting time reviewing the resume. You're wasting their time applying and potentially interviewing for the role, when you can solve for that upfront on the application process. What you don't want to add are things like, how many years of experience do you have? Subjective questions that aren't really going to help you early on in the process. Now, when you add these questions to your job application, your ATS then should be able to turn these into knockout questions, which helps you automatically reject candidates when they apply and don't meet the minimum criteria. And then you can send them a rejection email to let them know why you're not going to be moving forward with their application. So again, this is going to help you avoid spending time on people that just aren't going to be a fit no matter what their experience looks like. Now let's talk about a hiring SLA. So SLA stands for service level agreement. Typically you see this between two companies in a contract for services, but in this case, it's really just an internal commitment between all the parties that are involved in the hiring process. So for you, what you want to do is you want to define each stage of your hiring process, what needs to be done, when it needs to be done by, so a timeline, and who is responsible for it. And this helps you keep everybody accountable for doing all the things that they need to do in the time frame you need them to do it in order to meet some hiring timeline goal. And maybe you benchmark yourself against the stats earlier on in this presentation, but you want to work into some type of hiring timeline goal and then build your hiring SLA around it so you can see, the time that's required for each step and who needs to be doing it. And when you're falling behind, or you see in your analytics, in your ATS, that too many candidates are getting stuck for too long in this process, you actually have a plan that you can now go back to and either adjust based on maybe something that's more realistic, or hold the person accountable and figure out what's slowing them down. Why are people getting Why are people getting stuck in that step? And how can we unblock it to help that person be able to hit their responsibilities under the hiring SLA? And this just makes sure that there is constant movement in your process, and you don't need to be doing all these things like, hey, did you reach out to schedule this interview with this candidate, or did you review the interview from this candidate? There should be a lot less follow-up and just a lot more action. So, here are some scenarios that I often see with organizations that are struggling with their speed to hire. And they're usually running into this in the screening and interviewing step, which, as you saw, adds a lot of time to the hiring process. So typically we see that HR or somebody in talent acquisition is doing phone screens and then passes candidates on to hiring managers based on some notes that they took during the phone screen, or recruiters or HR at the front end of the process, or are setting up panel interviews with hiring stakeholders or multiple one-on-one interviews with multiple stakeholders, but earlier in the process. This isn't for a final round interview. And both of these processes are killing your speed to hire. So for one, let's talk about phone screens. They only allow you to advance X number of candidates forward in your process. So let's go back to the example where I said you had 100 candidates. Let's say 50 were qualified on paper. How are you going to do 50 phone screens? Most likely you're not, right? So you're going to start cutting corners and say, let's advance 10 to 15 people, which means 35 to 40 people are dropping out of your process. And those are qualified candidates that should be moving forward. So you need to figure out a way to unlock that. Remember, we talked about speeding up your hiring process, and unlocking volume as a result means that your candidate pipeline is full all the way through your process. So that's a big problem with phone screens. Number two with phone screens is that hiring managers then get frustrated by the quality of those final interviews that you're setting up for them, based on, they're making decisions just based on notes that you're sending them or based on your decision. And so that can create some misalignment, some of the blame game, and that's a big point of frustration that I often see. Now, when we talk about panel interviews or multiple one-on-one interviews with hiring stakeholders earlier in the process, not as a final interview, that again is a huge time suck. It's an incredible amount of time spent on preliminary interviews, and you've got to solve that. And this is where a solution comes into play. So enter the one-way video interview. So a one-way video interview is asynchronous, which means it happens on the candidate's own time. So think back to that hiring manager kickoff. This is where you're going to come up with a handful of interview questions. So essentially, what does the hiring manager want to hear the candidate answer in order for them to make a sound decision on who advances to the next step in their process? So you come up with these questions. The candidate then records video responses, but they do it on their own time. So instead of doing phone screens, we have to spend 30 minutes with every single candidate, and you just can't possibly get to all the candidates that you need to get to. The one-way video interviews are happening 24/7 when it's convenient for the candidate, and then you and your hiring managers can review them at your convenience. So most organizations that I see implementing this type of solution are using it as a replacement to a phone screen or a preliminary interview. And the impact of this is huge. So number one, you're able to interview significantly more people in less time. So again, back to that example, 100 candidates, 50 are qualified. With the phone screen, maybe you're advancing 10 to 15. With the one-way video interview, this is where you could push forward all 50 of those candidates and give them an opportunity to get in front of a hiring manager in a much more efficient way. Number two, from a quality standpoint, you're getting hiring managers to see a preview of these candidates before they make a decision on whether or not to invite them for a final round interview. So this gets hiring managers bought in much earlier in the process. The benefit to candidates as well as they get in front of your hiring managers a lot sooner. But ultimately, it makes it a much more collaborative process where your hiring managers can validate the decisions on who are being move forward to a final round interview with them, and it gets rid of that tension and some of the blame game that we talked about. So to wrap that up, now we're talking about speed, interviewing way more candidates in a lot less time, and we're talking about quality through the improved collaboration. So ultimately a better, faster, stronger hiring process as a result. Now let's talk about reference checks. So this is another step in the process that I often see dragged out, and usually it's because you've got one person that's trying to check multiple references for multiple candidates at the same time. It's a huge game of telephone. It's a ton of back and forth. It's a lot of coordination, and it can really add days onto your process, which you do not want to do when you've got a candidate at a reference check stage, because that means that's probably someone you're pretty close to hiring. So you can solve this by getting in front of it and automating it. So number one, by getting in front of it, what I mean is before you even do that final interview with the candidate, have them prepare their references. More than likely, and they should, and you'll want them to, they need to inform their references that they're going to be using them as a reference for this job. That could take a couple of days for them to not only get permission to use somebody as a reference, but also to inform them that somebody's going to be reaching out. So if you tell them to prepare this before a final interview, then they have those references ready. So immediately after a final interview, you can proceed to reference checks within 10 minutes versus now needing to wait a couple of days, which is what most organizations do when they ask for references after a final interview. So now you've got those references, but you can even speed this process up further by automating the process. So instead of you needing to collect all the references and then start doing the outreach to all the references, there are tools out there where you can have candidates submit their references to a platform, and the platform manages the outreach to those references, gathers all the responses, and then presents them to you in a clean report. And this is a great way to speed up the process. Again, this is something that can be done asynchronously. So you're not spending all this time trying to facilitate all these calls, schedule all these calls that will just add days to your process, when you want to get to the point where you can make a candidate an offer ASAP. All right. Now let's talk about the time between stages in your hiring process and what I like to refer to as the silent killer. So these are things like inefficient scheduling, where you're doing a ton of back and forth with candidates trying to find a time. This is the lack of communication with your candidates, where they don't know what's going on in your hiring process. They're sitting there like, do they like me? Do they not like me? Are they going to hire me? What's going on? So this dead time can often be a killer of the hiring process, because you might have candidates that just disengage because they don't know what's going on. They haven't heard from you in a few days. And then number 3, related to that, just mismanagement of candidate expectations. So when a candidate doesn't know what's next from you or when they're going to hear back, this is the moment where they might slip away and take an offer from somebody else, or just disengage with your process altogether, because they just don't know what's going on. And there are some simple ways that you can solve for these things. So from a scheduling standpoint, you can put your scheduling on autopilot. Again, now we're referring back to technology. So you can use a scheduling tool which allows you to connect your calendar, and that lets you send a link to a candidate who can then review your availability and pick a time that works best for them. And it gets rid of all that back and forth of email of trying to find a time. Similarly, you can do this with your hiring managers, whether it's sending candidates a link to your hiring manager's calendar, or whether it's you just booking the time directly on a hiring manager's calendar. This scheduling can be put on autopilot, and that's just one of those manual, tedious things that you can get rid from your process and save you days, if not weeks, in your process. The next thing is what I like to refer to as embracing the nurture. So this is about the lack of communication with your candidates in between stages. So you want to start weaving in what I would consider, or what I would refer to as nurture messaging, into your standard communication with candidates. So these could be things that really aren't giving the candidate an update, but it could be something as simple as like an employee testimonial video or a day in the life type of video. So this might be something where you know there's going to be a little gap between when you're moving a candidate from this stage to the next. So you might want to schedule an email or something in between there to send the candidate a quick touch base to just say like, hey, it's going to be a couple more days before we get back to you, but in the meantime, I thought you'd like to see, this video of a day in the life of somebody in a similar role at our organization. So it gets them excited about the opportunity again, gives them some helpful information about the organization, but again, just keeps them engaged in your process, where they know, okay, like I know there's going to be a couple more days. I heard from this company, cool, they still like me, they're still engaged. So it keeps them bought into your process. The other thing that you should start weaving into your communication is reminding candidates about deadlines you might have for them in the hiring process, or appointments that they have coming up. And when you can, if you've got the proper consent, I highly encourage you to use SMS text messaging to just get those messages and reminders in front of candidates more quickly. But again, not only does this keep you top of mind for the candidate, but it helps speed up your process because you're nudging them along to get to that next step and making sure that you don't have no-shows. Now let's talk about setting expectations for your candidates. So often what I tell organizations is outline your hiring process and put that outline on your careers page, put it on your job ads maybe, put it in an email autoresponder when people apply to your positions. Give them the full picture on all the stages and what the time is for those stages, or what you're estimating at least. This gives candidates an idea of where they stand in your hiring process and what's still to come. And then be realistic and give your candidates expectations based on your hiring SLA and when you're going to get back to them. So let's say you do a one-way video interview. I suggest that when you're inviting those candidates to that interview, you tell them a time frame for how quickly you're going to review their interview and get back to them. That way they know that they should expect to hear from you, let's say in 2 days. And so when they're waiting those 2 days, it's not like clear, like, okay, or unclear if, okay, this is going to drag on for 3, 4, a week. I don't know when I'm going to hear back from this company, so I'm going to move on. No, instead they know, okay, I should hear from this company in 2 days. So before I make any other decisions or opt out of this process, let me wait to get a decision because I know I should be hearing back. And when they're expecting to hear back on a specific day, that just, again, keeps them more engaged in your process, more likely to stick around, speeds up your process, keeps your volume high as you move through your process, and just creates a lot of great things for you as far as positive candidate sentiment as well about your hiring process. So let's recap. Speed to hire is a problem. We need to fix it. So we talked about 3 ways that you could start fixing it immediately. Number 1, creating hiring team alignment early on in your process so you can accelerate throughout the rest of the process and avoid time spent unnecessarily. So these are things like setting the job requirements, doing the hiring manager kickoff, the hiring SLA. All of those things will create alignment. Then we talked about replacing tedious and ineffective interview and reference check processes with asynchronous solutions. So these are things like the one-way video interview, automating reference checks, automating interview scheduling. All those things right now are taking up time in your day, and you can more or less automate those processes to give you a lot more time back and keep a lot more candidates in your hiring funnel. And then number 3, keeping your candidates engaged and informed to avoid dropout and create accountability. So again, that's where we talked about making sure you add those nurture touch points, those reminders to your hiring process, and giving candidates realistic expectations on what your hiring timeline looks like so they stay engaged and bought in. And the best part, none of these things are monumental tasks or projects. You could start implementing some of these right away, and I would love to help you do that. So as far as next steps, I've got my email here on the screen, jtolan@sparkhire.com. Put my LinkedIn URL up here as well, so feel free to connect with me. But shoot me an email, and I will provide you with an example of our hiring SLA. I will provide you with a list of asynchronous hiring tools that you can look into, and I'll even give you some example content that we use in our hiring process to continue communicating and nurturing our candidates through the process. So shoot me an email. I would love to help you. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope this was very, very beneficial for you, and I'm looking forward to you speeding up your hiring process. Take care.